This simple activity can enhance punching performance before training, sparring, or a competitive bout. Now, these are two recent papers by Mitchell Finlay and his colleagues. I believe it must be as part of his PhD research in amateur boxing. He will actually be coming on the Sweet Science of Fighting podcast in the next month. So make sure you subscribe to the Sweet Science of Fighting podcast YouTube channel or Spotify or wherever you listen to podcasts, because it'll be coming up there and it'll be live on this channel as well once I get it scheduled in. But here's two papers on this. He did the first paper just to essentially prove the concept and then followed up with that recently. So the first paper was in 2022 and the most recent one was actually last month in 2024. And they have very similar methodology, just slightly different ways of doing things as they progress through the research. So I'm going to cover the first 2022 paper first to give you some background on it, and then we're going to cover the latest study after that. But essentially they looked at post-activation performance enhancement, also known as post-activation potentiation. Recently that term has slightly changed just for terminology reasons, but regardless, it's the idea of potentiating a movement based on doing something beforehand. Typically, this is seen within the weight room where you're doing, for example, a heavy set of squats and then you're doing some kind of power or velocity based exercise. An easy example would be back squat paired with box jump. The idea is that you have now primed the nervous system during the initial exercise, and now you're able to display more force, speed, power, whatever it is in the subsequent exercise. Now there's a rest period between that. That seems to be highly individualized or dependent on the initial activity. But for this research paper, they looked at two upper body conditioning activities on punch and neuromuscular performance. So I'm going to run through these now. Now, the issue with implementing a traditional, say, post-activation potentiation or post-activation performance enhancement protocol in boxing is there's typically a lack of space or lack of equipment, especially when it's before a match or even before training or sparring. And so you're not able to do things like heavy lifting or throwing medicine balls, etc. So what they did is they took 10 senior elite amateur boxers. So I put these boxers through 3 different conditions before a punch test. So it was an isometric jab and cross, and that was 3 sets of 3 seconds. So think of holding the end range jab and end range cross against a wall or an immovable object and pushing as hard as you can for 3 seconds. The other one was a resistance banded jab and cross, 2 sets of 5 each side. So again, just think about having a band looped up to a rack and you're throwing your punches with that band. The final one was just a control. So they just performed the normal dynamic warm-up, but did not do any of the other 2 conditioning activities. After they performed these conditioning activities or the control, they performed 2 jabs, crosses, left and right hooks, and then 2 counter movement jumps, which are just vertical jumps. And they did that directly after their 3 sets of their punches, or 2 sets, depending on which one they did. And then again at 3 minutes after, and then every 2 minutes until 13 minutes after the last set of their conditioning activity. So essentially there's multiple time points afterwards because they want to identify when they likely see the greatest improvement in performance from those conditioning activities. Now, what they found was in this initial study was that both conditioning activities, so the isometric and the elastic band punches, improved punch force and rate of force development, but the isometric condition gave the greatest increase and over a larger time window. So essentially they were able to improve performance over a larger spectrum of time from those tests versus the elastic band condition. Now, most of the performance variables peaked 7 to 9 minutes after the conditioning activity. So essentially they performed isometric punches. 7 to 9 minutes is when they see the greatest improvements in punch force and rate of force development. But the main issue with this paper is the testing method. Sitting down on a single punch as you blast a pad, so the pad was against a wall, which was a force plate which measured that force, isn't representative of how you'd punch within training, sparring, competitive bout, as you're not able to just sit there and wind up on a punch. You're having to move, respond to what's happening in front of you, etc. And you're throwing multiple punches, typically not just one. So the authors took it a step further, which was just published last month in their newer paper, and they used the same study design, but instead of single punches against a force plate, they used the boxing specific exercise protocol against the wall mounted force plate. So this boxing specific exercise protocol is based on I guess you could say a work rate of amateur boxing, and they're just essentially given commands from an audio track to throw different punches at different heights, etc. So they get a similar work rate. They did over 3 rounds. So it's not just one punch, it's multiple punches and multiple rounds to see if these conditioning activities were able to improve punch performance under a more quote unquote realistic testing condition than just throwing one punch. Now, they performed the exact same conditioning activities, the 2x5 elastic banded punches, or the isometric 3x3 seconds, or the control, which was just the dynamic warm-up. So what they found was both the isometric and the elastic resistance enhanced punch force for the cross, lead, and rear hook. However, only the isometric condition induced improvements greater than the smallest worthwhile change, which is the change greater than the error measurements from testing, in rate of force development during the cross. No differences were seen in vertical jump between groups. And then when they broke it down into individual boxers' performance, the isometric condition was superior, with 6 boxers seeing performance improvements, whereas only 1 boxer saw improvements with the elastic resistance, showing that the isometric condition is likely better for most people than just the elastic resistance. But it also shows that there's an individual component to this, where some boxers may respond better to other modalities. Now, my interpretation of this current research with these PAPE responses in boxing is that it's going to be near impossible to see how various conditioning activities, and by conditioning activities again, I mean the initial exercise, affect boxing performance in sparring and competitive bouts. This is about as close as we can get with the current technology and the limitations of the PAPE response. However, I think it does provide some actionable data that you can use within your training. And I think this is where you're going to get the most out of something like this. So performing something as simple as a 3x3 second maximal isometric jab and cross before sparring, a competitive bout, or maybe important training sessions is probably worth a try. 1, it is not very fatiguing. 2, it's not very time consuming. And 3, it requires no equipment. You're gonna see potential upside in punching performance. It's gonna be an extended part of your warm up. So you're gonna probably feel even better going into sparring, competitive bout, training, whatever it is, from doing something like this. And that's where a lot of the post-activation, I guess, potentiation research kind of surfaces when they're comparing these protocols to other warm-up protocols. Typically, it's just a better warm-up. And this is one of those things where doing some kind of high force movement might be worthwhile doing. I will say one question that comes to my mind, and one that I'm probably going to ask Mitch on the podcast too, is around whether it's the conditioning activity itself being, say, quote unquote, specific to boxing, where it's elastic resistance punches or isometric punches against the wall, or if it's that they're doing an exercise that produces high peak forces and high rate of force development under these conditions, considering the isometric have more beneficial effects than the elastic resistance condition. In the isometric condition, you can produce more force, you can produce force faster. And I'm assuming that could potentially be one of the mechanisms behind better performance from that condition versus something like an elastic resistance punch. So potentially that means you could do anything that would elicit high forces and high forces quickly. So that could be throws, jumps, it could be heavy lifting, etc. Again, obviously you're going to be equipment space restricted, but it's a question that crosses my mind around research like this. So in terms of practical outcomes for you, again, isometric punches might be something you do at the end of your warm-up before a competitive bout or sparring. If you like this video, you want me to break down some more research for you, let me know down in the comments, and I'll see you in the next video.